Ethan Behrman, Left Coast News.
Thank you so much for listening to Left Coast News Dispatch 38 with me today. I really appreciate it. I hope you are sharing the shows with others. That is the most important thing that you can do to help the show grow. Now, here's the question. If you knew of a pedophilic rape ring, wouldn't you do everything in your power to make sure that it gets broken up and people would be held to account for what they were doing? Wouldn't you do that? Yeah, most normal people would. Well, not Jeffrey Epstein, obviously, or the, many rich and powerful men who were involved, and people like Ghislaine Maxwell is named everywhere throughout this stuff. And what's so weird about this case is, as I dig deeper and deeper into it, there's intelligence, apparently. He was apparently maybe an intelligence asset, but that doesn't mean that they would get him out of jail the way he did with Alexandra Acosta, the now former labor secretary who was the U.S. attorney in Miami when that sweetheart plea deal was cut. This case gets crazier and crazier. Now we find out neck bones were broken when he allegedly committed suicide at the MCC in New York. You can listen to my previous dispatch where we talked a little bit more about this. That was Dispatch 35, if you want to go back and hear some of that, where I explain more of what happened there. But now we have the autopsy, or at least some of it, that says, yeah, neck bones broken. Can happen in suicide. More often found when people are hung or strangled. That's when those neck bones break. Well, I have the opportunity to have a chat with a former FBI agent. He was an acting chief public corruption chief for a period of time as well. He knows how the FBI works, how they investigate these types of cases. His name is Jeff Cortese. And take a listen to our conversation. Let me know what you think as well in the comments below, and send me your feedback, leftcoastnews@ethanbehrman.com. What's transpired since July when he was arrested and how he's been handled?
Boy, there's lots to unpack there, and it really depends on your vantage point, your perspective. So investigators are going to be looking at things through a different lens than say jail or prison personnel. This is their bailiwick. This is what they do, these prison officials. They are very comfortable and very confident in what they do and how they do it. The brief research that I've done is trying to identify suicide attempts or successful suicides within MCC has resulted in very little information. Maybe something back in 1991, according to a colleague of mine who said he lost somebody back then. Aside from that, they're going to operate business as usual. There are a lot, unfortunately, of individuals who are in the system for sex crime reasons, kiddie crime reasons. And though their life is a little bit more complicated than say, other inmates, by and large, due to the fact that other inmates don't find, those who violate some of the, even the worst of bad guys has a child potentially that they love and care for. So coming across somebody who's willing and able to violate that is obscene, even to some of the most obscene in prison. That said, prison officials are going to handle their business like they typically handle it. As far as whether or not they're going to immediately put him on suicide watch, some of that's going to depend on a number of different factors. I will tell you from a law enforcement investigative perspective, his crimes suggested a high propensity for suicide. His just wealth as an individual, he's accustomed to a certain lifestyle, right? He is in prison for something that's going to draw a lot of attention, and the wrong kind for someone like him. He potentially has a lot of information on wealthy individuals, powerful people. So could potentially be some loyalties that he feels towards them, and not wanting to give them up. That could create guilt. So putting all these factors together, wealthy, in for pedophilia, powerful people in the country and in the world that he might have to out. He, from an investigative standpoint, from where I'm sitting, is a high risk of suicide. From the prison perspective, they're going to handle it as they typically do and check their boxes as they normally do. And those things might not match up.
What you just pointed out is something that's very interesting. I don't know. I went back and I did a little research, Jeff, and apparently, according to a source, this was reported July 9th in the Daily Beast. And what you're saying is a propensity to suicide. Many of us on the outside look at it and go, well, it's a propensity for something nefarious as well. According to the Daily Beast, when Alex Acosta was interviewing to become labor secretary, this specific case came up, his plea deal with Jeffrey Epstein, where he did something that is essentially unheard of, which is to seal all co-conspirator records as well and not inform the victims. But apparently, according to this source to the Daily Beast in July 9th, is that, and I'm going to quote this, I was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone. So that leads a lot of people, and I would assume an investigator as well, to say, what's with all of these connections to the most powerful and wealthy people on earth, allegedly, wouldn't they have an incentive to do something that, again, doesn't require me to go hire a hitman, but maybe make sure that the guards aren't looking so we can enable and facilitate his suicide?
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. I think there are a number of possibilities. When you get to a point where you have the attention of the whole world, and as you pointed out, this has captured the attention of basically everyone in the country and a lot of people around the world. It is the single event that I can identify that has put both sides of the aisle on the same side, right? This is the most unifying event in the country right now, and it's an interesting thing. It's because of the allegations are so horrific. Is it possible that people would want him to be dead? Yeah, absolutely. If he has information on powerful people, they're going to be interested in him not being able to give that information to law enforcement, of course. Would it require somebody going in and quote unquote putting out a hit or killing him in his cell? No, not necessarily. To your point, it could be as simple as just not being around to witness or to watch him. If he does have a high propensity or willingness to do it, and if on July 23rd he really did try to take his life, which that to me is still a little bit unclear as to how that played out. Just not watching him might be enough to accomplish the goal. Whether or not that happened is, at this point I haven't seen anything that doesn't make sense.
When you say doesn't make sense, what do you mean in terms of like the evidence? So we got, now we're starting to get some of the autopsy details that he had broken bones in his neck. And according to a number of sources I read, said that happens more often in strangulation than it does in suicide. And if you're in a jail cell, I can't it's not like I'm hanging myself from a tree like a lynching of 120 years ago, or a hangman's noose where you drop and snap your neck. In a cell, isn't that a little harder to snap your neck? So again, from an outside public perspective, I look at that and I go, well, I have a lot of questions here. I have a lot of doubts about, everybody the whole step of the way through was incompetent. Why would you take him off of suicide watch so quickly? Why was he, even in the mental health unit, you're supposed to be at a higher level of observation than general population at MCC where he was placed. Now we talk about broken bones. Yes, you can have broken bones from suicide, but that's usually in a more violent situation. I'm not familiar with a cell at MCC to know how you could do a violent suicide. But when those raise questions, to your point, everybody on both sides now are like, wait, there's something that needs to be investigated here. There seems to me that there are a lot of questions, and I'm assuming from an investigative standpoint, you want to follow all of those leads out, especially in a high-profile case, and even more especially because the Attorney General is saying this should be a priority to investigate.
Oh, absolutely. And you know what? No disrespect to the system and to the process and to the Attorney General or anything like that, but we're trained not to get emotional about our investigations, but it is hard not to take this very seriously. This is a big deal, right? There were a lot of people who were hurt, allegedly, from this man, and to watch so many potential subjects maybe go away when he goes away. In other words, he had a lot of information in his head. So there are FBI agents, there are IG agents, there are people taking this very personal and are enthusiastic about following every single lead. To your point, there are a ton of questions. And boy, every time we, open up the newspaper, it seems like a new one presents itself. Without question, the agents are going to be aggressively chasing each one of those questions down, each one of those leads down, until they come to a solution and an answer that they can prove. There's little doubt in my mind about that.
Do politics have the ability, from your experience, to play into this? And there's a second part of that, which is your background in corruption and training law enforcement about corruption and being in charge of the public corruption unit. Aren't there just so many different ways where if somebody wanted to make this happen, again, doesn't require some guy walking in with a large firearm or something really, really nefarious, but something subtly nefarious, there are so many ways to get that done. How do you begin that process of tracking that down? So we can talk about the fact that we should track that down, but what does that look like?
I think to your point, you start at the beginning, understanding what the policies and procedures are within the prison, speaking to the different guards, the different personnel throughout the process, understanding more clearly and more definitively what happened maybe on July 23rd. I think they already know the answers to a lot of those questions, right? So then, understanding on a step-by-step basis. Okay, so he's put on suicide watch. Who takes him off? What was the process? What calculation did they utilize? How does this look against the rest of the population? Have we had similar events whereby the prison handled it the same way? Or is this a completely unique way of handling it? Did something deviate from their normal process? Talking to the guards, understanding from their perspective what had transpired on the night that Epstein took his life. It's a pretty standard investigative process in terms of what the FBI is not going to have to utilize any kind of unique techniques. It's going to be a lot of just rolling up the sleeves, going through the process, watching a lot of video, finding out who's been in to visit, who has access, who are the different people that would have access to them, watching every piece of video, not just in that hallway, but in the hallway next to it, in the hallway next to that, until you get all the way out into the parking lot. Understanding what the financial situation is with the guards and they're gonna go through this process, check every nook and cranny that they can to identify if this was a legit issue or was somebody asked to look the other way.
You mentioned watching the video, and one of the first things that I tweeted out when this story broke was somebody better hurry up and get a copy of the video and make sure that there are duplicates of all of the video from inside and outside. And now we find out video is missing. I mean, my experience, so I have a lengthy background in technology, information technology and information security, is people know when a video device is not functioning, and they know it.
Right.
It's recorded somewhere that, hey, this thing's been out. There's a requisition order in to replace it. I've not heard anything like that. All I've heard is that video is now missing. There are a lot of things here. I know that doesn't equate to a conspiracy or to guilt of somebody that's involved, but they raise a lot of red flags.
No, I mean, absolutely. I think we're somewhat restricted in the domain in which we're operating right now because we're not getting everything, right? We don't know everything that law enforcement knows. So, when questions pop up in the media, they spread like wildfire. And sometimes it's a little bit hard to disseminate truth from fiction. That said, assuming, the accuracy of everything, And based on the limited information we do have, that's an absolute red flag. It's a red flag that the guards didn't do their rounds for a few hours. There are red flags throughout this. It's a red flag he wasn't on suicide watch. It's, there are red flags throughout. Ultimately, that doesn't necessarily mean that something nefarious was, implemented or driven by somebody outside of Jeffrey Epstein himself. But boy, these are all things that need some clarification. I mean, we have, some of the latest information on the guards is, I think they didn't do their rounds for 3 hours. They're supposed to do them every 30 minutes. They were allegedly asleep, I think, is what we're hearing. And they falsified records, right, saying that they did their rounds. Certainly when they woke up and realized that this guy was dead, the reality of what they had just done hit them like a ton of bricks, and they freaked and took the kind of the coward's way, right? Cover up's always worse than the crime. Instead of admitting what they had done and admit to violating policy, they, as we're understanding, lied about it and basically violated law. So if they're willing to do that, right? If they're willing to falsify the records and then lie about it, did they take the video? Is that video showing that they didn't do their rounds? They knew that, so they decided to destroy the video. There are legitimate questions. There are legitimate ways it could have played out that still don't necessarily lead to somebody taking a proactive posture against Epstein. But to your point, this all needs to be vetted out and figured out.
What jumps out at you as being a primary avenue? I mean, is it really just the guards at this point that you're checking all their financial records, make sure there are no anomalies? Is it, seeing if they have any connections to people who are connected to this case, or what would you be looking for most right now?
Boy, this is uniquely complex. And I say that because I try to put myself in the situation of the guards themselves. And they're critical to this, right? I mean, all these other details are certainly important. Why was he taken off suicide watch? All of that. It's a very fluid process. We could learn something in that line of questioning that sends us down a different path. But taking everything as we understand it, the guards are obviously a critical point in this process, this investigative process. Where it becomes increasingly more complicated is they didn't need to be paid for it. And what do I mean? It almost doesn't, we're going to look at finances. We're going to go through that process. We're going to talk to the right people and try to understand what's going on in their personal lives. But given the alleged depth of obscenity and depravity of the crimes, just asking somebody might be enough. I could see myself, being a husband and a father, justifying or seeing somebody justify, just kind of walk around a little bit longer or stay away from my cell a little bit longer, and somehow in the middle of all that, finding a way to justify it. Now, obviously it's not justified and it wouldn't be right and it would be wrong, but I think there's an argument that could be made that somebody could be talked into it without even having to take a dime, which in that case would complicate things even more, obviously, right? Because you're not going to be able to show an exchange of goods.
Well, that's fascinating. So that's a little bit like, I don't know the details on this, but I remember when Jeffrey Dahmer was brutally beaten to death, the guards were mysteriously unavailable, right? And they were never supposed to be left alone. But that was the kind of inmate where people felt right or wrong in their own minds. I say wrong only from the standpoint of, justice and we have rule of law in this country. But there were people who were like, yeah, he needed to die. And therefore the guards just happened to not be available. Nobody got held to account because nobody really were that upset that Jeffrey Dahmer was dead. The difference here, of course, is we need justice for the 100+ victims of Jeffrey Epstein's pedophile rape ring. And the absence of Jeffrey Epstein makes it far more complicated. Now we've got to try and get Ghislaine Maxwell. Now we've got to try and use other forms of record keeping to go after these co-conspirators. And it's an exceptionally more complicated ability to get those people. And so to your point, while maybe you can justify in your mind as a husband and father myself, boy, there is nothing worse than what Jeffrey Epstein was doing.
Right.
We can't find justice without him, or it's way more difficult to find justice without him.
No, I agree. And it's really hard to kind of watch all this unfold, to be honest with you, especially given the fact that so many screamed, pay attention, watch him. Don't let this happen. It seems so many anticipated that he wasn't going to make it to trial. And that makes this even more painful to watch. And I can't help but think that there are going to be significant changes in the prison system after this. And it does nothing to make up for the fact that, as you pointed out, all these victims are going to lose a little piece of justice. It's unclear. The FBI and DOJ are going to be vigorous in their investigative process. They're going to continue to use all the tools available to them to dismantle the trafficking organization and everything else. But if what we hear in social media is accurate, some folks were reporting that Jeffrey Epstein had received some sweetheart deals a couple days after he was arrested. If that is accurate, now that's a big if, but if it is accurate, that he was already talking, and I guarantee the agents were going to talk to him as long as he's willing to keep talking, and they're going to keep talking to him as frequently as they possibly can. But everything that he said at this point becomes hugely problematic, right? We've talked about this before, the hearsay component of it. If they don't have other evidence to support at this point some of the information that he could have been able to provide on a stand, then they're going to lose out on potentially some of these monsters who have been walking around for years unidentified, and potentially will continue to be unidentified because of Epstein no longer being here to point the finger.
Really appreciated Jeff Cortese's time. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. From a law enforcement perspective, a former FBI agent, a former public corruption chief for the FBI. And, again, for us, we want justice. I want these people held to account. And it's really hard with Jeffrey Epstein dead to make that happen. And this is the problem that people just don't understand. The Sixth Amendment has the confrontation clause. If somebody is presenting evidence of their word in court, well, you have the right to confront them unless they were under oath previously and were cross-examined. I mean, it's like, this is really damaging. We still have the Ghislaine Maxwells. We still have other people, but it's just way more complicated. I want to hear your thoughts on what should happen next with Jeffrey Epstein. What do you think really happened? Leave me your comments. I want to know what's on your mind. I know that I think that rich and powerful people were involved. I don't believe that this was just a simple accident. That, oops, guards fell asleep. Oops, guards falsified records. Oops, it's just that sloppy and that crappy at that prison. I just don't buy it. I simply don't. I believe that, to Jeff Cortese's point, it's possible. It's not a grand conspiracy that just these guys thought he was a bad enough guy and, well, we're just going to minimize our care for him because we don't like him. I think that that's possible. I think it's also likely that there was something more there. I don't know for sure, but we're going to find out. But I want to know your thoughts. Comment below. Send me your feedback at leftcoastnews@ethanbehrman.com. Really appreciate you listening. Again, please, if you enjoy the show, share it with other people. Post it on social media as well. Leave me your comments. Follow me at Ethan Behrman. I'll talk to you in the next dispatch.